I don't think so. There we go.
Talk shit.
Recording started.
Recorded live.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation or around the world. Once again, you are listening to the VMware Communities Roundtable Podcast. This is podcast number 548. My name is Eric Nilsson, and with me today I have my regular co-host, Matt Lungeth. Today is Wednesday, March 24th. Matt, how are you doing today?
Eric, just when you think you might be having a bad day, you read about the MV Ever Given. Did you happen to catch this? This is the 1,300 foot long, 200 foot wide, 220,000 ton cargo ship right now that is blocking all of the traffic. This canal, which I think is about 12% of the world's freight. So just when you might be thinking you have a bad day, somebody always might have it just a tad bit worse than you do. So a little bit of perspective there. But how are you, sir? How are things out there? How's the weather? And what's the color of the bay?
Well, let me tell you, Matt, that's a great starter there. I think we've all looked at servers crashing and trying to bring things back up and going like, oh, how do we get out of this? And you're facing a 24-hour cycle of trying to dig yourself out of a hole. They're probably trying to dig that ship out of a hole right now because that's brutal. That's brutal.
I mean, we talk about port blocking, right? But this guy has taken it to an all new level.
Oh, we are so punny today. On this show today, I will get to the weather report. On the show today, we are going to be talking to, Robert, and I'll let Robert do his own last name. He's a consultant for ITQ in the Netherlands, out of the Netherlands. So, Robert, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell us how you say your last name, and then we'll get to the weather.
All right, thanks a lot, Eric. It's Robert Kloosterhuis, and I really don't expect the average English speaker to be able to pronounce it at all. So there's a reason I usually use my nickname, the Fluffy Sysup.
Oh, there you go. Well, hey, thanks for coming on the show. I know it's kind of late out there in the Netherlands, so we appreciate it. And you have a popular article, Tanzu for Beginners, that you've put together. It's one of the, I think you did a video series on it as well, a recording. So we'll talk to you about, what it takes to get Tanzu up and running. But before we do that, let's talk about the Bay Area, what the color of the Bay is here. So color of the Bay in California, in Palo Alto, the whole Bay Area, it has been 70 and warm and sunny, so we're finally getting some nice warm weather. It's been a little bit windy, so the bay is a little bit choppy, but it is a nice, happy light green with a bit of a chop because of the wind, but sunny and bright here in Northern California. So thanks for asking, Matt. Before we get to the show, let's talk a little bit about the news. We do have to promote the Cloud and Modern Apps event that's going to be happening March 31st, 11 a.m. Pacific, APJ April 1st, 11:30, and EMEA April 1st, 11. It's going to be a presentation by Raghu, Kate Colbert, and a handful of others. We've been promoting it. If you're a vExpert, you're bound to have seen our email on it. It is a pretty good session. They're going to have examples of, running cloud apps on Kubernetes, vSphere 7. So this show where we're talking about Tanzu for Beginners kind of ties into that. And they have some announcements to make. So it should be good around how to manage and as well as consume modern applications in the enterprise on VMware products. So it should be a good announcement. I know there is going to be an announcement there. So come check it out. I think it's only going to be an hour and a half. And plus they're going to have added session content. So again, you can go to VMware.com. Right on the banner is a reg for the event, or you can go to VMware.com/app-cloud-event.html. Go register, get your friend to register, come check it out. I've been privy to some of the session content, and I think it's pretty interesting and a pretty good story. I like hearing it, so it's probably worth your hour and a half to go listen to that. So, Matt, I think you have some additional news. Why don't you tell us what's going on?
along those lines, and I'll let Corey go into details with this, but if you're one of those V-experts out there that are listening along to that Cloud and Modern App event on the 31st, I know Corey is looking for content. So if you're blogging, vlogging, all things about that event, and you want to have those events or that particular content promoted, Corey has details on that as well. And then I just want to briefly mention that tomorrow, so Thursday the 25th, we have the Southwest Regional VMUG Virtual UserCon with Duncan Epping keynoting. So over at vmug.com, you'll see the registration for that. And I'll let Corey pick up on some of those promotions that we're doing around the Modern App event and the content for V-experts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I put out a couple tweets as well as a couple emails to the experts. Like Matt said, if you're writing blogs, creating content, send that information to me. Send me those links. We want to promote that content. I've also asked for blog articles prior to. So if you're currently writing articles, send that to me as well. Anything around those topics. If you're curious what the topics are in a little bit more detail, go read my email and you will see it, and then send that back to me, and we'll get that promoted and marketed into our channels.
All right. Thanks a lot, Corey. Thanks a lot. All right. With that, now we get to have some fun, talk to Robert about, Tanzu for beginners. So, Robert, we always start. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do in the VMware ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah. So I've been in the industry for about 20 years. I've been the first 10 years of my career I spent doing service desk, Windows sysadmin stuff, and the last 10 years I've been focusing very much on backend infrastructure like storage, and eventually the VMware ecosystem. And I kind of fell in love with the VMware products the moment I saw them. I had my own little vMotion moment, and I've tried to touch every single part of the whole VMware portfolio if I possibly could, and I've worked with a huge amount of the different products. Of course, a lot of it around vSphere itself. A few years ago, I saw that the kind of the tide towards where applications are being deployed was shifting to what we're now calling the modern application management, Docker, Kubernetes. Started getting into that. I joined ITQ about a year ago, specifically to focus on cloud native, and ITQ has given me the opportunity to work with some amazing customers of ours to do exactly that. So I'm still pretty new to the whole cloud native ecosystem. I'm still not very great with Kubernetes hands-on, but I like to be broad, and I like to have a good story to tell our customers, and give them some help in what direction to take towards application modernization. So that's kind of what's brought me here.
All right. And so you're experiencing, these customers, did these customers have a solid vSphere environment, and now they're looking at transitioning applications, build new applications? How do you see the introduction, of Kubernetes to what I would call our vSphere ecosystem from a customer perspective?
Well, yeah. So we specialize in the basically the VMware portfolio. So we build our expertise around that. A lot of our customers have a long history with doing basic vSphere core, a lot of VDI, the vRealize stack, and you're seeing two things happening. At the one hand, VMware has made a strategic decision to get into the Kubernetes ecosystem in a very, very serious way. So the news around that and the direction VMware is taking and all the product announcements around that, they of course reach our customers. So some of them, that's the first time they've heard of what's going on around modern application deployments, and then others, the ones that have internal developers, the customers who are slightly larger and slightly more mature in their application ecosystems, they're probably already looking at Kubernetes, so they're examining the market, and of course they're probably already running VMware products in their infrastructure. So then the leap to Tanzu becomes something that of course immediately gets on the radar, and we're seeing a lot of traction there right now, with the people wanting to do proof of concepts and wanting to really get into the weeds to try this stuff out. But on the whole, the average kind of vSphere admin among our customer base, Kubernetes and containers are still pretty far away for most of them. Of course, there are huge variances, but it's still most of them are kind of heads down doing their day-to-day work around vSphere mostly, and storage, and that a lot of people are unsure what to make of all this Kubernetes stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because if you look at my world, where we're running, Chorus on, SaaS services. So I'm running WordPress internally, right? We have a pretty big WordPress stack now, and for all the blogs, I think we have 80 blogs. If you really ask me, I'd be like, well, I don't do application development. We host these apps, we run these apps, we care about systems and their performance, but until WordPress goes to, a modern app, Kubernetes, architecture, it doesn't impact me, right? I'm still just, I care about vSphere, I care about VM performance, I care about page response times, all that kind of stuff. And that it really takes when you have a bigger app, if you're writing your own app, or if we were customizing and doing more development, that's where you get into the more exposure to Kubernetes. Yeah,
and besides companies that have internal development starting to experiment, play around, even deploy using containers, also third-party vendors are now increasingly starting to deliver their software in the form of containers, container images, and it's interesting the different variations you see. One of the flavors of containerized off-the-shelf software that you see appearing is application companies actually providing an entire spun-up Kubernetes deployment for you in the form of 3 VMs that you need to install. So they've actually done all the work. They've removed any kind of dependency. They just bring it back down to the basics, and they provide a complete Kubernetes deployment in the form of a 3-way cluster, and then run their application inside that. And you're seeing all kinds of variants of that. On the inside, many appliances are basically running containers. Harbor is a great example of that. If you deploy it as an appliance, so it kind of runs the gamut right now. And then there are companies are saying, look, the next version of our software is going to be released primarily as containers. We're gonna start making a managed Helm chart, and then they run into the issue that some of their customers might not have any Kubernetes in place yet. So this is there's pressure from all these different sides to now really seriously start looking into how to do Kubernetes. And the interesting thing around propositions like Tanzu, they're made to remove a lot of the pain of getting started with Kubernetes, and they do so successfully. But a lot of these companies that are just getting into containers, they haven't actually experienced that pain yet. So that can be an interesting conversation. This is a managed Kubernetes deployment. Well, what's so hard about installing Kubernetes? And I was like, well, you should try it manually once, and then we can talk again. If you look like propositions like Tanzu or OpenShift are kind of ahead of the curve for a lot of companies, because they offer a solution to a problem that many companies still need to discover the problem in the first place.
Yeah. And is that problem set really scalability? Is that where they come at it and go like, this architecture scales, and so therefore, or is it just kind of like everybody's doing it, so we might as well be there so that all the systems are compatible? Kind of like when people moved from Unix to Windows Server, right? It was just because it wasn't that Unix was bad. It was just that there were more Windows Server implementations happening, and you just naturally migrated there because it was going to fit what people were running. So there was that. Then there is, some inherent architectural advantage that maybe Kubernetes brings. Yeah.
So what we're seeing is people want to get started really quickly with Kubernetes. They don't really know what it's about. They don't know what's involved in getting it running, to manage it, to lifecycle it. Of course, things like vSphere with Tanzu give you a very, very quick way of getting started. But then so does things like Kind and Minikube, right? So people are experimenting in all these different ways. Once they get beyond that stage, then they start to think a bit like, okay, how are we going to build an application around this? Now, for the more mature companies, they probably can already see that there's a bit of a lifecycle challenge around these new stacks. These stacks are pretty complicated. Kubernetes itself is pretty complicated if you've never seen something like that. But to get Kubernetes actually running in production, you need a lot of stuff around it. And to manage that whole stack together, that's a bit of a challenge, especially if you're not used to running complicated, say, a platform as a service stacks or container as a service stacks before. So that's the pain I'm talking about, right? And that's where so first you have to kind of explain to people, well, this is the stuff you're going to run into once you want to start to manage, lifecycle, monitor, update, upgrade these stacks. And but we've already got you covered, because here are the ways to mitigate that pain. And I mean, among our customers, we're all over the place in that journey. Some of them we've gone through that. Some are, many are right at the beginning of that.
Okay, Matt, we'll transition to Kubernetes for beginners, but before we do that, do you have anything you want to ask the fluffy sysup? Maybe not. Maybe Matt. Maybe Matt's lagged. Can't really tell. Maybe I'm lagged.
We just lost audio there for a second, I believe, and Robert's rejoining us, perhaps.
I'm still here, and I could hear Eric. Okay.
Yes.
So
okay, there we go.
All right. Okay. So Matt, I just thought I would transition to Kubernetes for beginners, but before I did that, I thought I'd throw it to you and see if you had any questions for Robert.
So Robert made some great points there about how now in some instances where these organizations are looking at above, we can deploy it, but how are we going to do day two operations? How are we going to manage the life cycle of this? And then where are we going to do the actual management of, or where are these deployments out? Are they on premises? Are they on a cloud provider? Is it true native? I think it's not only is it about so much the day two operations, but then it's under that same consistent platform that we have within vSphere. So regardless of where that workload's at, again, on premises at a major cloud provider or with a partner, it's all under that familiar control plane. But let's bring this full circle a little bit here, Robert. When you're having these initial conversations that, with a development shop or these particular IT firms, and they have devs that are out there, and we need Kubernetes. We need Kubernetes, and the traditional vSphere admins and that whole entire infrastructure team goes, well, I guess we need Kubernetes. How do you introduce them, right? How do you introduce them? How do you train them up? How do you play that consultant training wing to bring about the traditional infrastructure admins over to this new interface and this new deployment model?
So ITQ has been in this game for a while. Before Tanzu even existed, we've been big fans of the Pivotal ecosystem. So we have customers where we've done implementations of Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and later PKS, what now called TKGI, and I'm personally quite a big fan of Pivotal's approach around exactly this. Pivotal had an organization called Pivotal Labs, now called Tanzu Labs, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong on the terminology. It's a set of services that they offer where they will do an intensive training with engineers of the customer to train them up over a long period of time, several months, very intensive, with pair programming and a completely agile way of working, to get them onboarded as quickly as possible across these very complicated stacks, which consist of many different tools that some of these engineers have never seen before. And they teach them the fundamentals of things like GitOps, which is something, again, lots of vSphere admins won't have dealt with that before. What I found is that that is the right approach. If within the VMware ecosystem, we're kind of used to sending people to courses for a week. The thing is, though, is that these stacks are so complicated and they consist of so many moving parts, and to get them successfully integrated into your business, so you get real value out of them, requires doing a hell of a lot more. It also requires you to change your way of thinking. It's more
That's it, right there.
It's a more developer-minded way of thinking about how to run infrastructure. Infrastructure as code is a huge part of this. You introduce concepts like pipelining, which goes a little bit more beyond scripting.
Right. Commits and whatnot, if you really want to take it to that next level.
Yeah, because that's the way you manage these platforms, whether it's Cloud Foundry or Tanzu. That's the way you get reproducibility. That's the way you get consistency in deployment, and that's the way you manage the life cycle. Now, I have to say that depending on which flavor of TKG of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid you implement, the amount of work that's already done for you by the platform kind of differs, and we can get to that difference in a minute. So for vSphere with Tanzu already automates a hell of a lot of the life cycle around it. So in that case, I would have to do less pipelining myself, right? But if I were to implement what is now called Tanzu Application Services, the rebranded name for what used to be Pivotal Cloud Foundry, or actually Pivotal Application Services, I should say, that to manage that environment, you still need a lot of customization around that to get the real value out of it. So you have to introduce all these new skill sets, and sending people on a training for a week is not going to cut it in many cases. And besides the upskill that you need amongst engineers, of course, the whole way these platforms are used is very different from a business perspective, from a code management perspective, than what you're used to with VMs. So you also need a cultural change within kind of not just your IT department, but the entire way you approach these platforms has to be different. The principles around things like availability and stuff like that are very different than what we're used to with VMs in vSphere. So it can be enormously challenging, and but I think customers, companies need to keep in mind that to make really efficient use of these new technologies, the value you can get out of them is huge, but it's a real commitment. You need to invest, especially in skills and in people, to get the most out of these platforms.
I think it's a great explanation. It's so much more above and beyond the technology itself. I mean, it's an operational mindset, a change from the C-level executives down about what this means for the delivery of application services. It's truly, when we say modern application delivery, it's a fundamental change in the approach to the delivery of services to the customers of the org, whether that's internal or external. And to have that proper adoption, it needs to come from the top down. And it sounds like a long runway. Have you found that in your deployments that the operators that are out there that see a little bit more and experience, let's say, the pain of doing some of those deployments rather than having everything stood up and ready to go, appreciate it a little bit more, or maybe a little bit more competent operators?
Yes, I think that too. I think to once you get used to these kinds of tools, this way of working, it makes you more competent, right? It is really going to skill you up, right? You're going to start thinking about configuration in terms of code. You're going to start thinking in code in terms of how do I manage that code. So you have to start thinking about Git. All these things kind of follow logically. So you start adopting you're almost kind of forced to, but it makes sense to start adopting all of these new little skill sets along the way that are all complementary to each other. If you learn how to use Git, then suddenly pipelining becomes more manageable, especially if you're in a team. If you learn to pipeline, then suddenly the scripting stuff becomes more fun because you can start stringing things together and getting more work done in a more consistent manner. So it becomes very powerful very quickly, and all the while you're learning, because for a lot of people this is new. What I've seen is that the most successful what we call platform teams, teams managing these kinds of platforms, they are very passionate engineers, and they're very much turned on in that learning mode, because they're going to have a lot to learn if they're coming from an infrastructure background. But the same is true for developers, right? These teams, you could say they're kind of an example of a DevOps kind of way of working. So you need broad skill sets, not just infrastructure. Especially on the top end, if you add software like Cloud Foundry, like Tanzu Application Services on the top end, having developer-oriented skill sets, people coming from that world, and having an interest in the layers below it, it's extremely powerful. You need a good mix of those skill sets to get the most out of these stacks. And the same is true for Kubernetes in itself. A lot of the Kubernetes is made to make the life of developers easier. So a lot of the concepts and a lot of the methodology comes from the developer and from the open source world. So it helps very much if you start working on these platforms with people with already one foot in that world, and then you combine the best of both, and that's the recipe for success around these platforms.
So that's the 30,000 foot view, right? We've talked about the organizational change. We've talked about the mentality that it takes. Okay. We wanted to highlight here is your session that's coming up,
right?
That we have on April, I believe, April the 9th at 10 a.m. Pacific, that is out there on VMware Code. And Eric, do you want to speak a little bit to that, and what's those particular events or this series of events?
Yeah, so which is part of the reason why Robert is here. He has an upcoming session. I think it's Tanzu for beginners, and we do code sessions, power sessions throughout the year. You can join VMware Code. You can go to code.vmware.com and join, and we send emails of events that we're running, sessions we're running. We try to run a power session on code topics, infrastructure as code, or just scripting, PowerShell, all these type of topics. Every couple of weeks we try to run one. They're live streamed. You can go check them out. So Robert, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Tanzu for beginners?
Yeah, so Tanzu for beginners, which we had a slightly different title for before we got a bit careful around branding, it came out of some of these conversations I've been having with customers. It was a way for me. Basically, I started using PowerPoint to just write down my thoughts, to organize. It started with just the brand names. The Tanzu portfolio contains such a huge amount of, frankly, confusing names, a lot of overlap, and basically VMware rebranded everything. Everything's now called Tanzu. Even things that are very different are all called Tanzu. So I found myself in very confusing conversations with customers trying to explain, well, no, this is this bit and this is that bit rebranded, and so that's how it started. But I started incorporating all these other topics that I keep running into. For example, people are used to VMware being basically a proprietary kind of closed source deal. The software you bought from VMware was built, programmed, delivered, packaged by VMware, sold to you against licensing cost, and it's basically it does magic. It does very powerful magic, but it's not open source. You can't really see what's going on. VMware is now shifting to a model where a huge amount of, especially the Tanzu portfolio, is based on open source projects. Now, I was already kind of familiar with that concept because Pivotal was operated in this way. But for VMware, it's actually quite new. And what's interesting to see is that even VMware internally is still trying to find its way in how to deal with the fact that a huge amount of their technology stack is based on these open source projects. It leads to all kinds of interesting effects. For the average vSphere administrator, this is a completely new, bold new world. It's still, Tanzu is still a commercial offering, which means you have the advantage of being able to go to VMware and get support on this stack, which is validated and which is integrated by VMware for you. That's what makes it a managed Kubernetes proposition, right? But it's still based on all these open source projects. So if you really want to dig into the weeds, you now have this entirely new avenue of opportunity to get to the actual open source projects that are behind many of these technologies. It's you can actually do a lot of what the VMware toolset does outside of Tanzu by pasting all this stuff together yourself. But that's the whole point, right? Do you want to actually build all this stuff yourself, or would you rather have someone build an opinionated stack that does all this stuff for you? This is a bit of a cultural question. It's a philosophical question. If you have a very powerful DevOps team, you can build it. You can build it all yourself, or you can get one of these managed Kubernetes propositions. The fact that it's based on this open source software and that it creates all these different effects we've noticed it can be challenging for VMware to get used to this itself, and challenging for VMware's customers. So I found I had to explain something about that dynamic, and I had to explain something about the open source ecosystem and about the CNCF, for example, the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, because a lot of the development that VMware does relies on stuff coming out of those open source projects. So the release cadence of Kubernetes, when in Tanzu we talk about things like conformant Kubernetes. What does that mean? This is terminology that most IT admins are probably unfamiliar with if they come from an infrastructure world. So the presentation I put together was basically trying to explain some of the fundamental concepts around how VMware is approaching building a proposition based on largely open source tools, but adding commercial closed source, special source to make it even more powerful, and how those two things balance out when you start using the product.
Nice.
There's always something to be said for that commercial support, right? With what's more of an enterprise, as we had talked about with Kenny Coleman last week, that the enterprise release and then the support to go with it. We can always put the nuts and bolts together on our own, but someone else that can put the resources of an entire organization like the size of VMware behind it to validate those particular nuts and bolts together, and then support behind that, there's obviously a tremendous value there for enterprise.
Yeah, and you can't know everything yourself. As these stacks get more complicated, especially if we start to add ancillary services to these stacks to support application architectures, we can't, a platform team that specializes around delivering Kubernetes, delivering maybe Tanzu application services, it might not be possible to also be an admin around MySQL and RabbitMQ and Postgres and Redis. Yet these application components are often needed as part of a modern kind of application architectures. What we're seeing is an interesting mix where some development teams will simply manage that stuff themselves and build it into their application deployments. But what we're also seeing a lot of, and this is where the challenge is that they're expecting IT, the platform teams that are already managing Kubernetes and Tanzu application services, to also provide these ancillary services as part of what the service the platform provides. And there it becomes a skill set challenge, because again, how many different tools, how many different open source projects can you be an expert in? So that becomes an extremely good reason to go down the commercial offering path. More opinionated, but better supported. It gives you a backstop, because you're going to run into stuff that you're not going to be able to figure out yourself unless you really dive into the open source project yourself. But there is of course always the time constraint, right?
Yeah, I can imagine this whole job description, right, where the complexity gives you more functionality. But as a traditional IT admin, I didn't really have to worry about so many of these pieces, right? Like I installed vSphere, I ran vSphere, I had to make sure I had storage, I had to make sure I had network connectivity. But now you're getting into a much tighter integration to the application itself, right? And all of a sudden your job workload goes up, and maybe we can enable you to climb up into that space by giving you a package solution that sits on your existing infrastructure. But there's still a lot of work that an IT admin is going to have to go through to just learn all the components. And I guess the question is, will IT teams expand, right? Will that roles expand? Will that be something that stays over with a developer? How do we see those workloads being managed?
Yeah, I think IT teams will need to expand. Now, there's an interesting argument to be made there. It's like, well, hold on, shouldn't we be getting more stuff done with the same amount of people? Well, you are, but you still need to skill up. I think on balance, the potential of these platforms to completely change and upgrade the way you deploy code, the way you write software, the way you iterate on the software, the value add of successfully using these platforms is going to outweigh the extra skill sets you're going to need to onboard in your IT teams. But on the whole, I do think, considering the complexity of these stacks, IT teams will need to grow a bit. And what we often recommend customers is that they start something we call a platform team, a dedicated team, DevOpsy team, to specifically run these stacks, which sit right in the middle between developers who might not want to do any of this stuff and traditional infrastructure. But what we also see is that you can't do islands. You also have to continuously talk to each other, because aligning all the different parts of the stack is super, super important. You have to have a continuously ongoing conversation with all developers to make sure that how you're managing and deploying the Kubernetes or the TAS stack fits their needs. But at the same time, you have to align with infra to make sure that the underlying resources are aligned. And if you look at something like the way Kubernetes uses persistent volumes in vSAN, making sure that there's alignment in between the different parties involved in just storage, I haven't even spoken about networking. It's super important that people don't get out of that closed silo thinking and start working together. So you want there's always going to be specialization. So you're going to have something like a platform team, but also everyone has to start mixing up generally in order to make these things successful.
Yeah, it does. I always think of accountability when it comes to this as well, right? Because, as you expand the number of pieces that are integrated, you have to deal with, who's accountable for what component. And to me, Tanzu actually helps that problem a little bit, because instead of needing a platform solution and then a Kubernetes solution and then your applications team building their solution, you actually have the platform and the Kubernetes pieces all integrated so that you have one place to go to if you have issues through those two pieces of the stack.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to see even how VMware has different options here. So vSphere with Tanzu is an example where the emphasis is placed on enabling current vSphere admins to very quickly get started with Tanzu Kubernetes Grid clusters. Right? It integrates Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, which is a kind of a separate thing. It's a separate technology, but it integrates it. It wraps it up into an extremely easy to use deployment model, which uses vSphere native pods for the management components, and then allows you to spit out either on the command line or in the UI new Kubernetes clusters on demand in the vSphere interface, right? The interface that everyone's familiar with. But then you also have Tanzu Kubernetes Grid standalone, which is more loosely coupled from the EAS it's on, and it's also able to run on Azure and on AWS, I believe, and that gives you exactly the same Kubernetes cluster lifecycle management, but it's slightly more loosely coupled. So even there, VMware is giving us choices which direction to go. They've built a great fundamental technology called TKG, but then they offer it in different ways as well so you can mix and match which part of your IT organization is better suited to actually get started with that technology.
Right. Okay. So getting back to your course, we'll just do the check boxes of your session. What are you tackling in your session? Could you give us just the index card of the highlights of what you're going to cover?
Yeah. So start with just the basic Tanzu story. Where did it come from? Why has VMware invested so much in containers and Kubernetes? Then I talk a little bit about the relationship between open source and commercial software, and the investment VMware has been doing there. And then I basically kind of lay out the Tanzu portfolio as it exists today. And I'm constantly, like every few weeks, I'm updating my slides, right? Because there's so much going on. I think I've managed to capture the entire portfolio in one slide, more or less, which is not easy. But I probably won't be able to because it's still growing. Well, actually, what's happening is that VMware is still swapping parts, right? As they're figuring out how to do a managed Kubernetes offering, they're also optimizing a lot. So in previous versions, a certain open source project might have been used for something like authentication or ingress, and they're swapping it out with something better. So my slide deck changes every few months based on the latest bill of materials that Tanzu actually consists of. Remember that VMware, as to build this proposition, has acquired a whole bunch of companies the last few years, and they're still acquiring it, right? You saw Mesh 7 just a few days ago.
Right.
So of course, integrating these products takes time, and that also tends to make things shift. But what you're seeing is this trend where it's getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and it's becoming it's still maturing. And it's already extremely powerful. I lay out the portfolio as I know it, and then I go into some detail about the different flavors of managed Kubernetes that are currently being offered. I already discussed the two versions of Tanzu Kubernetes Grid that exist, vSphere with Tanzu, and then TKG in and of itself. And I reference, where these different bits came from, right? We bring it back to what is Project Pacific again then, right? This is stuff that some vSphere administrators remember hearing about 2 years ago because there was a lot of noise around that. But that term has gone away, right? But that's still what people remember. So I try to bring it back to the stuff that they might have picked up from the last 2 years. And that's, of course, challenging because VMware tends to change the branding and the naming of things every few months. So that's what the slide deck is a like guide in the Tanzu portfolio. And then we dig into some details, right? What is the difference between vSphere with Tanzu versus standalone TKG, sometimes referred to as TKGM? And then, of course, there's still TKGI. What's that then? Right, well, that's the previous managed Kubernetes that came along with the Pivotal acquisition, which is still an extremely powerful and very stable and very reliable base to also do Kubernetes on. So I talk a little bit about that as well. So it's basically, here's the whole roadmap. We zoom in on TKG, and we start picking apart some of this terminology, some of this branding, and we lay it out, and then we end up with Tanzu editions, right? We know that VMware likes to package their products in suites, easier to sell. We know that vRealize suites, the different editions that vSphere is packaged in, Enterprise, Enterprise Plus. they've done the same with Tanzu. So so I go into a bit of detail there. What are the differences between some of these Tanzu editions? Which components do you get in which version, under which circumstances? Because, depending if you have NSXT or not, things change. So I help explain how all these differences work together. And like I said, I try to keep the slide deck up to date all the time. So every time I do this talk, it should be the latest representation of where we are right now.
Yeah, sometimes people cringe at how much we repackage things and rename things, and that we're always shifting some things. And on one hand, I go like, oh, marketing. I live in marketing, but it's like they're always renaming things, changing things, rebundling things. But at the same time, VMware is one of the most nimble companies I've ever worked with, right? And you don't see VMware running into the problem that Sun Microsystems has or SGI, where they were too slow, right? And they weren't willing to stay current. And big companies, it's a lot of work to stay nimble and stay current. But if you're a big company, a small company that's just jumping into a market, they don't have to rename anything. They just build something and there it is. They got one or two products and they're very current. Where what I like about VMware from that perspective is that we are willing to rename things. We are willing to throw things out to change what is the current product strategy based on, and we're not afraid to get into areas that are changing, right? That are changing fast. We're willing to jump in and try to lead it as well. But that does on the back end mean that, every year or so we might be changing what's in offerings, what their names are and how they're put together, because in these edge type industries, that's what you have to do to compete. But it does protect, VMware's ecosystem because we are doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you can't, if you're going to be a big, container ship, it might be hard to turn around and not get stuck somewhere. I stole that from the chat. So yeah, I'm very impressed by the willingness of VMware to switch strategies and to embrace very boldly kind of things that are not in their wheelhouse traditionally.
Right.
All right, 3-4 years ago, a lot less people had heard about Kubernetes. And remember, VMware was experimenting with doing managed containers. Back, remember Photon platform?
Sure.
So this is, so there's it's wonderful to see how innovative they are, and then to see some of the decisions recently made within the MAP BU around the Tanzu portfolio. Bold decisions, which impress me. It's exactly what you say. Not every company dares to be as nimble as this. Remember, of course, there are also downsides, as we've seen maybe in some of the marketing and the messaging around Tanzu can get confusing for customers. But on the balance, I think I would rather have innovation and being backed by a company that can keep up with that innovation. Which is exactly what makes me a VMware fanboy.
Yeah. And once VMware gets its act together and things do solidify, we do pretty good at then packaging it up and enabling it and allowing you to purchase it. And even some of the announcements we're going to have on the 30th, which we're encouraging people to go sign up for, is about that. Is about the ability to purchase it and acquire it without a lot of work, right? Because and getting it, making it available. So we'll be making some good announcements there. So I got to give VMware credit for being in this space and being nimble. That's what I say here. Right?
Yeah.
And then
it gives me about a week to update my slide deck.
Exactly. But then guys like you that are actually on the edge learning it, that's the other thing I'm always impressed with the VMware ecosystem. As soon as we enable something like this, it's kind of like, if you work for a stale company, after a while, you get bored, right? Like if everything just stays the same year after year after year, you're also looking for something to do that's more innovative and cutting edge. And VMware enables that as well, right? I mean, that's the fun thing about being in this space, is that we don't walk away from it. And that allows everybody to have something new to work on, right? Even though it might not be part of your day job yet. So I want to come back to for beginners. So you're covering all of that. Do you recommend in your session how to get started if you haven't built out anything yet?
Yeah, well, I do end up with some links at the end of my slide deck. These are resources that may have been mentioned here before. Things like hands-on labs is obviously a fantastic place to start, especially if you like learning while doing it, right? Hands-on experience. And I just like to remind people that the hands-on lab, you can do anything you want with those environments, right? You don't need to follow the lab material. If you want to just quickly get started, messing around with Kubernetes, like just the other day, I was trying out some load balancer stuff. I was like, where do I have a Kubernetes environment lying around with NSXT? Oh, I know. Yeah, so it's very powerful tool set, and I hope people are aware that they have entire environments for every single VMware product just lying around, ready to mess up, play with, break. It's fantastic. VMware has put a lot of effort the last year or so into educational resources around Kubernetes and around Tanzu. And there's actually more there's more out there than people realize. I mean, there's obviously Cube Academy, which is a great video learning starting resource to start with, but then there's also things like the Tanzu Developer Center Central. Hold on, let me find the right term so I get it right. Where that's more oriented towards DevOpsy people or maybe developers, but right. It's the VMware Tanzu Developer Center. Right. Some fantastic resources on there, like video stuff, courses, example code. They've got 3 different CI/CD tools on there with examples on how to use them.
I was in a VMware code coaches meeting yesterday, and one of the code coaches said that we also spun up a thing called Educates, which is like a platform that gives you Kubernetes instances that you can then deploy into your own Kubernetes environment that creates you a lab that you can go do on your own infrastructure as well.
Yeah, and I've never even heard of that. And I was in the same session yesterday, and I'd never even heard of it, and it was incredible. And then another thing that was mentioned yesterday as well is the Spring One conference. So again, this is a part of VMware's ecosystem that many people are not aware of. When Pivotal was originally spun out of VMware, it was around the Java Spring ecosystem, and that's where tools like Cloud Foundry came from originally. Right, as a way to facilitate pushing of code around, basically enabling developers. Now, Pivotal's been, brought back into VMware, but the Spring ecosystem and everything around that still exists. So the Spring One conference, I attended it last time. There was a whole track squarely aimed at us, at the infrastructure admin who's busy in the middle of upskilling and trying to get a grasp on how to do some of this modern app stuff. So I'd also very much recommend the Spring community and the Spring One conference to anyone listening to this as another great resource and a great fount of information. And then, geez, the amount of video content that's coming out of the Tanzu community on YouTube is just absolutely stunning. What's that weekly?
Yeah, weekly Tuesday. I forget what they call it, but it's Tuesday, Google Tuesday and Kubernetes VMware. You'll get it right where the Tanzu team comes in and just takes a topic and runs weekly every week, kind of like the community podcast is doing. They just do them routinely. I don't know how good they are, but what I've learned is if you just keep doing everything weekly, you get to it. You get to the topics that people want to hear about.
Yeah, so there's actually an overwhelming amount of educational material out there just out of the VMware ecosystem, let alone everyone else that's currently doing it. So all you need is the interest and the will and some time, which can be a challenge. Something I struggle with. But all the stuff is there, and we're getting in a really great place educational wise around the VMware stuff.
You can Google Tanzu Tuesdays. Right. And
that's available. It looks like off the VMware Tanzu YouTube channel, and it is a live Twitch stream every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Pacific.
Yeah, the twitching. Yep, nice. All right. Well, we're coming up. We have been live for 55 minutes with Robert. So, Matt, have any other questions you want to hit Robert with before we wrap up and ask him what he's going to be doing this year and how to follow him, etc.?
Well, I will go right to that. So, if our listeners are interested, Robert, in following you, how are you out there on socials, and what's the best way to get a hold of you?
I think the primary way is Twitter. I'm the Fluffy Sysop on Twitter. I also have a blog, thefluffyadmin.net, but I don't blog very often. But if I'm doing something hands-on, I run into something a problem that's ungoogleable, I tend to make a blog post, but it's not. I don't blog as much as I'd like to. But yeah, Twitter's the main one.
All right, and let's get a quick 30 or 60-second overview of that handle. Well, why the Fluffy Sysop?
Oh, I don't know. It just stuck. I can't even remember how that got started.
Certainly unique, a great one out there. The Fluffy
it's
Sysop,
quite memorable. Yeah. And it's supposed to be memorable.
He just doesn't want to tell us what it is, right? Truth be told, you like teddy bears or something. Well, we'll go there.
Yeah, maybe one day over a beer.
So you're, yeah, exactly. So you're busy. You're doing sessions. You're doing VMware Code Session, VMware Code Coach. You're Tanzu. You're doing that. You do your day job with what is it? What's your company again?
ITQ.
So ITQ. Yeah.
There you go. ITQ. So any major plans next year or this year, I guess, as we go into 2021? Yeah, what is your whole goal of accomplishing something this year?
Well, I do like speaking at events, and of course that's been a bit hard the last 12 months or so. So I'm really hoping that we can get this COVID thing behind us. And I really missed VMworld last year. It's just not the same online as hard as everyone tries. I really miss the in-person thing. I mean, I go there to network most of all, and it's just been a tough year. I'll, as I said, I keep iterating on my Tanzu for Beginners, but there are some other ideas in the pipeline. I don't have the energy I wish I had to do a lot of presentations and to build a lot of decks. I certainly hope to get into the weeds around vSphere with Tanzu soon. And that will probably result in some blog posts and maybe some inspiration for maybe another code session, maybe for the big code conference that's going to come up.
Yeah, we are planning the Code Connect. Looks like it's going to be a 2-day event again this year. Looks like we're going to have more coding sessions, so looking forward to that. Plus, maybe some tracks that go. So looking forward to that. So, Robert, thanks a lot. Kloosterhuis, I guess, maybe.
Very good. Yeah.
We'll go with that one. Thanks for being here. Really enjoy the conversation. We're trying to lead into the March 30th event. Please go register and help our numbers. We're always looking for our community ecosystem to drive awareness. And if you have somebody that's interested in the topics of modern applications and you want to hear Raghu, come talk about where we're going with some of this stuff and our product announcements, and Kit Colbert and the founder of Kubernetes. I forget his name. It's not Joe Beta. It's the other one. Craig McCluckey. Craig McCluckey will be there doing the event as well. Come do that. And as we follow up, Robert, thanks a lot. We will take us to the V Barbecue report because it is nearly lunchtime here in California. So I think we'll ask Tony Foster to come in here. Tony Foster, thanks for everybody listening to the very end. With that, we will give you a V Barbecue report. So Tony Foster, what do you say about barbecue?
It helps if you're unmuted.
There you go. Of course it is.
So the good word is steelhead trout. I fixed that. Yeah, it turned out absolutely wonderful. Fixed that this last Monday. The best steelhead trout I've had in a long time.
So I know some people take the trout, wrap it in tin foil, put butter in there, do whatever. How do you barbecue a piece of trout?
So I did mine just bare skin on the grill.
Bear skin. All right.
Yeah, just take it out, plop it right on the grill.
How much time and what temperature? How do you know when your fish is done?
So I was running about 350 temperature wise on the grill. Skin side, I did it just a touch longer than I should have. About 5 minutes is what I did on the skin side. Then I flipped it. On the flipped side, it was about 3 minutes. And temperature gauge, of course, you can also watch the skin, and you'll actually, or not the skin, but the flesh of the fish, and you'll actually see white goo start oozing up, and that'll let you know that you've got a pretty good cook on it.
You're good. Any kind of seasoning, or you just go native?
So we did this one with umami seasoning from Trader Joe's, and it was just absolutely phenomenal.
Very good. Very good. That sounds good. That's a unique one. I haven't done that one in a while. We have been eating fish. Want to get those omega-3 acids in your omega-3, what do we call them? Not fat.
They're a fatty oil.
Fatty oil in your system. Really good for longevity. So want to do a couple pieces of fish every week if you can. So don't always just barbecue the big piece of steak and some chicken. Got to get some fish in there as well. So that's good. I did some steaks, just the classic thick piece of steak. I did learn a little hard lesson on that, where they came out of the freezer and we didn't quite thaw them, and so it was fine if you like medium rare, because you get blackened on the outside, no problem. The temperature said 144, 145 when you stick it in there, but let me tell you, when you have little frozen bits in there, that'll make it kind of medium rare, deep in the middle. So note to self, make sure your meat is completely thawed before you do that. Put salt on, lots of salt. Don't pepper it until you're almost done with the grill, because the peppercorns will char and burn. So did that. And that's my report. All right, we're at the top of the hour.
A real quick shout out to Tony as well, that there was an announcement that was made last week that he is a 2021 member, I believe a continuing member, of the NVIDIA vGPU Community Advisor Program. So congratulations to Tony on that designation.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Thank you.
So what do you do? You just do Bitcoin all the time? That's what the vGPUs are used for now, right? You're trying to get a few more fractions of a Bitcoin.
I guess if you wanted to do that, you could, but it's not the most efficient use of a GPU. No, I do a lot of stuff around VDI by day, compute by night. So VDI and HPC and AI and all those things in the virtual environment, and getting the most out of the GPU cards that you have in your environment.
Congrats for that. Good job. All right, with that, we're going to end. Everybody have a good piece of barbecue, and we will be back here again next week. Until then, I apologize for the laggy video on my screen. If you happen to be watching on the V Barbecue channel, and you can give us a like and a follow. Talk to you guys later.